Good morning.
Good morning.
Are we live? Yes. All right. This is panel 8, Science, Stories, and Deep Survival. So let me introduce you to Usha Alexander. She was born in India to Indian immigrants who came to the United States in the 1950s and to the very small town of Pocatello, Idaho. She ran away to university at the age of 19. And after a meandering education studying chemistry, biology, and anthropology, Usha joined the Peace Corps and taught high school science at the archipelago nation of Vanuatu. She later worked for many years at Apple Inc. in San Francisco Bay Area. Since 2013, Usha resides with her partner, writer and photographer Namit Arora in the National Capital Region of India. She is the author of 2 novels, Only the Eyes Are Mine in 2005, and The Legend of Viranara in 2018. Her writing has also appeared in 3 Quarks Daily, The Caravan, White Wall Review, Pangyris, Scroll, The Punch Magazine, and The Best American Travel Stories, 2007. And I found her on 3 Quarks Daily about 2 weeks ago and said, "You're coming to the conference." So here she is. Okay, roll the video.
Hi, my name is Usha Alexander. Today I'm going to speak about how our big cultural stories evolved as we went from being foragers to becoming peasants and urbanites. I'm going to tell a story about the stories of Adam and Eve, as well as the Epic of Gilgamesh, about how these stories might have arisen and how they influence our dominant ideas of progress, nature, and human destiny, even today. So, as the story goes, in the beginning, the God of the biblical creation myths makes the earth and sky. Over the next several days, he makes the sun, moon, and stars, the grasses and fruit trees, and rain. Then, scooping up a bit of fresh mud, he molds a being who looks much like himself, a man. And into this homunculus he breathes life. As a dwelling place for this newborn Adam, he plants a lavishly abundant garden, filling it with beautiful and delicious plants. The Creator then warns Adam that of every tree in this garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you may not eat of that, for in the day that you eat of it you will surely die. Then, realizing that Adam might feel a bit lonely, the God gives him cattle and fowl and all the beasts of the field. Yet none of these seems quite a suitable companion, so from one of Adam's ribs, God fashions a woman. Quite pleased with his handiwork, the divinity instructs his new humans on how to live. He tells them they must increase their population. They must also replenish the earth, and in doing so, to subdue it and exercise dominion over all of its living things. The Almighty then leaves the newlyweds alone to get on with their business of eating and procreating, replenishing and dominating, which they apparently take to just fine. In fact, neither of the pair has any memorable commentary on their situation, until the day that serpent piques Eve's curiosity, telling her that if she and Adam were to eat from this one forbidden tree, rather than die, your eyes shall be opened, and you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Now Eve takes new notice of this tree, understanding that it could make her wise. Enticed, she plucks a fruit and munches it. Whatever she discovers then, new knowledge or wisdom or just fine flavor, is simply too good not to share with her husband. And despite their creator's clear injunction to him, Adam follows his wife's lead. Yet soon the hapless couple realize that this new state they find themselves in, their eyes having been opened, is indeed problematic. They seem to have transgressed some cosmic order and find themselves possessed now of a discomfiting self-awareness, of moral judgments and political motives, just like the God who made them, and distinctly unlike the beasts that they lived among. When their creator finds out what they've done, he's enraged. He remarks, "Behold, the man has become one of us, to know good and evil." For serpent's part in this transgression, the Creator curses him to be forevermore the enemy of Eve and her progeny. He then condemns Eve, saying, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow in your conception. In sorrow will you bring forth children, and your desire will be to your husband, and he will rule over thee." To Adam he says, "Cursed is the ground for your sake. In sorrow you will eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and also thistles will it bring forth to you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread, till you return to the ground." With that, he drives them out of the provident garden that he had created for them, forever barring their return, and condemning them to a life of tilling and toiling for their subsistence. This was now our human destiny. Many aspects of this Genesis story are striking, not least its seeming contradictions, large and small. These may be partly due to its having been an amalgam of older oral histories, as myths tend to be. In this case, possibly inherited from the peoples who were absorbed into the expanding agricultural civilization that was coming to dominate the eastern Mediterranean region of the mid-Holocene. I find the story intriguing also because it seems to recall, however dimly, that there was a time before the advent of agriculture. In that before time, it hints, all manner of delightsome foods had been abundant and freely available for the taking. All the inhabitants of this divinely resplendent garden had to do was to nurture and command it and raise their kids. But by the time this story is being recounted by the presumed descendants of Adam and Eve, those idyllic days have tragically ended. The Garden of Eden is beyond reach. The ground is cursed. Food can now be procured only by tilling fields of grain for their bread, through sweat and hardship. It seems surprising from our modern vantage that in this myth memory, the livelihood of agriculture comes as a punishment, as a retraction of God's gift of abundance, and a sharpening of patriarchal norms. Today, we generally recall this same agricultural milestone as the agricultural revolution, the moment our species moved on from our presumably uncivilized nomadic lives to begin our journey of human progress. But it would seem that in the ancient Levant, from whence this story hails, what we see as progress was clearly imagined as a diminishment from a more privileged and comfortable condition. And though theologians still often refer to man's fall from grace as defining our human condition, the plain meaning of the words no longer truly resonates with our dominant narratives and cultural expectations of the human story as one of steady advancement from benighted beginnings. Myths and legends always rework older established narratives, motifs, and themes, tapping into what's perceived as timeless wisdom or knowledge. They can be inspired or inflected by ideas and events reaching back many millennia, even as they reflect and edify or legitimate changing priorities and practices, new power structures and beliefs. Much as several elements in the biblical flood story predate the Old Testament, it's possible that the Genesis creation story also contains fragments and strands of cultural inheritance that figured large in the lives of the people who had inhabited the forests and riverine grasslands of the ancient Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, during the earlier millennia of the Holocene. That was a time when nomadic livelihoods were transitioning toward increasing sedentism, at first in strategic and flexible stops and starts, but ultimately culminating in complete dependence upon fixed field agriculture, supporting urban centers. So, did that generous and unspoiled garden that fed Adam and Eve invoke for its earliest storytellers a misty, hagiographic, cultural recollection of the relative freedom and effortlessness of pre-agricultural life? Did it represent an inherited nostalgia for what were to them already ancient times, during which their foraging ancestors were accumulating by slow degrees the paradigm-shifting and dangerous knowledge that nudged them away from ease and plenitude toward the heavy yoke of agriculture? As they experimented with their first simple settlements of stone and millennia later of brick, as they intentionally broadcast a few handfuls of wild seeds and then millennia later plowed their first fields, had their understanding of themselves and their place in the world been shifting? Were their eyes being opened? Was this newfound self-regard the original sin that led to the death of Eden? Was this story a foggy recollection by those ancient tellers of what they had lost in giving up their intimate knowledge of the non-human world, especially their sense of humankind as belonging to a reciprocal web of life, beholden to the earth system as they understood it, in order to adopt a new sense of themselves as being different from and above all other life, singular and godlike? We should remember that foragers generally know what they're doing. Their use of resources is, by necessity, flexible and demanding of forethought, intention, a sophisticated and intimate knowledge of a broad range of environments, ecosystem dependencies, and animal behaviors. They strategically shape the land to benefit themselves, but they strive to remain within its sustainable limits. Foragers know that if they overtax their lands without investing in compensatory and regenerative practices, the land will ultimately bring forth less of everything to support them. This isn't to suggest that they have always succeeded at sustainability at every moment, especially when entering new ecosystems or encountering unfamiliar species. They surely faltered and even failed. We know of failed forager colonies and practices, and there are doubtlessly more we don't know of, buried under ancient sands and swamps. But the many societies that managed to flourish for thousands of years did so only because they figured out a workable balance. As they experimented with new subsistence techniques and cultural practices, successful societies took heed of the feedback they got from the land. Unless they encountered extraordinary conditions like wildly fecund bottomlands and a warm, stable climate, or discovered game-changing technologies like petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides that delay the consequences of overexploitation by many generations or even centuries. Foragers could learn from and respond to unintended consequences before they were locked into irreversible dependency on any particular unsustainable practice. So long as their population densities remained low compared to the carrying capacity of the land, it may have made little difference how much foragers took from their environments. But they may have discovered the land's limits if their populations began to swell, which can happen during a prolonged period of sedentism, for instance, or when the climate suddenly and drastically fluctuated. Newly sedentary forager farmers would have understood how precarious their situation was, how great a gamble it would be to depend too heavily upon their few cultivated plants or animals. They would notice, too, that too much planting or grazing displaces other plants and animals, leaving their own crop more vulnerable to pests and reducing the availability of other needed resources. For example, cutting or burning back forests too far to expand grasslands for planting or grazing may reduce access to nut trees, honeybee hives, medicinal plants, firewood, or other forest products. Likewise, overgrazing a grassland increases erosion and turns it to dust, leaving it unproductive for further grazing or planting or foraging. When they saw such signs of overexploitation, villagers who still retained their knowledge of a broader spectrum of subsistence strategies across environments might decide to disperse and resort to some greater degree of nomadism. They might eventually move their village elsewhere as conditions allowed, something they or their elders would have done before. They would have adjusted their behaviors and patterns to fit the circumstances and left the strained environment to regenerate on its own time. That is to say, they actively adjusted to the changing environment rather than forcing the environment to conform steadfastly to their needs. But the foraging villagers occupying the alluvial delta of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in southern Mesopotamia found their environment so rich and regenerative that their population had plenty of room to grow. To feed a few more bellies, they could broadcast another handful of grass seeds onto the seasonally deposited silt flats, then gather more grain and graze another sheep the following summer. Even if they did outgrow their immediate environs, or if a pestilence drove them out, which was an increasing risk as both villagers and their livestock were proliferating, rather than disperse, they could simply inaugurate another village in the same bottomlands and continue with their same way of life. After having followed this same way of life for some 4,000 years, their villagers were spread throughout the delta, each one harboring several thousand souls, and slowly growing. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, it may be that this deltaic region was supporting a higher permanent population density than had ever previously been amassed anywhere. Something else was happening, too. It seems they may have been losing their broader knowledge of ecosystems, and along with it, the broader subsistence strategies and belief systems of their now quite distant ancestors. Without that knowledge and understanding, their options became constrained. And even the richest bottomlands have their limits. At some point, the resource requirements of the people climbed beyond the regenerative capacity of the environment, especially since these permanent settlements required great amounts of wood for building, for firing kilns and forges, much more than their immediate environs could sustainably supply, and far more than their nomadic ancestors had required. They were deforesting the riverbanks, all up along the river's courses. This triggered new patterns of erosion and siltation across the delta, which increased flood risks to their towns and cities and hindered their farming. They surely noticed how their landscape was being degraded and changing. What's more, the stories they were now telling themselves about the right way to live and what was important and how to address their troubles no longer recognized that ancient, tried and true strategy of nomadism. Their whole relationship to the land was changing. Even their gods were moving away from being abstractions of natural elements toward becoming projections of the things that human beings make and do. Like Ninurta, formerly the god of thunder and rain, now the god of farming and the plow, or Demujid, earlier the god of the force that causes sap to rise in plants, and the end of the dry season, now the god of milk and of shepherds. And with that, they were learning to invest their faith in agriculture and urban social models. They searched for remedies within these realms that they considered superior knowledge. They discounted the half-forgotten knowledge systems of their ancestors, and with that, they lost alternate framings for their problems. A situation, I would argue, is very akin to our present one in the world today. For them, any form of nomadism had become an irretrievable, almost incomprehensible way of life. They had lost the details of its sophisticated knowledge systems and deep environmental awareness. They had lost the cultural institutions and value systems that had made it work. They only held on to these mythic tales of a richer, easier time that was now long gone. Instead, they relied more heavily on their new knowledge. They planted more on the floodplains and beyond. They traded surplus grain and finished products like cloth or pottery for the everyday items they had once gathered, like wood or honey, stone, metal, now sourced only from afar, brought downriver or across the valleys by those foreigners who remained as nomads. This production of surplus grain and the growth of trade encouraged greater craft specialization and maybe also greater ritual specialization, which perhaps had fostered greater economic disparities than had ever existed before. Now separated from their once deep knowledge and experience of the wider living world, they were focused on understanding a handful of crops and livestock. Having abandoned their broader strategies of ecosystem stewardship, they now strategized ways to narrowly maximize their near-term gain for their large populations. One mechanism they discovered to augment agricultural production involved more strenuously controlling the lives within their own communities, particularly the lives of women, by arrogating their labor as well as their reproductive capacity to produce the more labor is needed for agriculture. It's easy to imagine this beginning as a cultural value, becoming a positive social pressure, and eventually solidifying as an institution in which cultural and economic forces allowed most women little leeway beyond a life dedicated to grinding grain, attending to their husbands and households, and bearing and raising children, while simultaneously devaluing their capacities for other social contributions. Agriculturalists learned to control the lives of animals more strenuously too, dominating larger herds and drafting them into heavy labor. And they drained the wetlands where once their ancestors had gathered and hunted, trapped and fished, instead now to plow fields and plant monocrops and channel rivers for irrigation. Only in the sweat of their brows did they eat bread from their fields. But even with such steep investments in their localities, they still were forced to periodically abandon and rebuild their farms and cities. Irrigation salinated their fields, rendering them unusable after a time. Epidemic diseases broke out among the populace or their livestock or their crops more and more frequently because of the dense way they lived. So for 1,000 years during the mid-Holocene, their agricultural cities serially rose and fell, and in rebuilding ever more complex and rigid societies enclosed by walls, they advanced their knowledge of selectively promoting or diminishing other living communities in service to their own survival above all, which was readily becoming a commitment to human paramountcy and male supremacy. Now, when they recounted the mythic memories of their ancestors' more richly abundant world and more leisurely lives, they may have been vaguely aware that they were caught in what we might call a progress trap, though their word for it might have been curse. Agriculturalist societies were contorting into hierarchies of power that their ancestors couldn't have imagined, and sometime around 3500 BCE, a monarchy was established at Uruk, which is generally regarded as the world's first city-state. It was probably also the world's largest settlement at the time, housing between 25 to 50,000 inhabitants. Most of these toiled ceaselessly, suffered chronic injuries from heavy and repetitive labor, and died young. Famine, malnutrition, bondage, plague, and tyranny, the kinds of calamities that were only intermittently known to their foraging ancestors, had become regular features of their condition. Women found themselves triply constricted, their conception multiplied, their economic independence eroded away, their vigor sapped by unprecedented degrees of debilitating iron deficiency. Life in Sumerian cities was killingly hard, yet ecological destruction was multiplied to produce a greater surplus in order to comfortably support a class of elites, of priests and bureaucrats. Keeping this urban enterprise running was highly leveraged, burdensome, and precarious, and the only way to sustain it, as the lands were used up and the city dwellers were now dying almost as quickly as they could be birthed, was to expand it, to take over new lands, new resources, new populations of laborers. Sometimes they sacked, or were sacked by, armies from nearby polities much like themselves. Sometimes they attacked or were attacked by companies of inscrutable nomads. Edicts were passed to control subjects and slaves from trying to flee beyond the city walls. Agriculture, statism, and expansion seemed the only way forward. Despite its difficulties and sorrows, many saw it as their destiny, which they continually worked to improve upon, largely by doing more of the same with ever greater intensity. Meanwhile, as agricultural city-states multiplied and entrenched themselves throughout Mesopotamia, they were also inventing bureaucracy and record-keeping, new political modes and strategies for cooperation and coercion, trade and taxation. Their stories were also changing to normalize their new life ways and experiences. We can see some of this reflected in the stories they told, in the contesting sentiments that churn beneath their transforming and renewing value systems. For instance, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a collection of Sumerian legends and myths about life and death and kingship. These were etched into clay tablets, which were found buried among the early Bronze Age ruins of southern Mesopotamia. These texts hint at a very ancient cosmic order, which even the Sumerians referred to as the olden times, when a pantheon of elemental deities were still paramount. The gods of the olden times, these elemental deities, were called the Anunnaki gods. They were the ones who created the earth and sky and human beings, though the specifics differ greatly from the creative work of the biblical God. The reign of the Anunnaki gods is mostly remembered as a time of easy abundance. It was during these olden times, when the ancestors of the Sumerians were still semi-nomadic foragers, that they had mastered the baking of bread and they had learned to ferment beer. They were already beginning to understand themselves as something apart from the other creatures of the wild. And then they suffered an overwhelming tragedy when the Anunnaki gods brought forth a devastating flood, because the gods were getting aggravated by the noise of the growing human population. But long after all these epic events, by the time scribes were setting down praises of King Gilgamesh of Uruk, the primacy of the Anunnaki gods had waned. Most of them had been supplanted by a new generation of fully anthropomorphized Sumerian gods befitting their post-Diluvian civilization. But the persistence of the Anunnaki stories suggests that those olden times still retained some degree of cultural relevance, perhaps a fading nostalgia. Maybe there were even other stories of the Anunnaki gods still circulating among the oral traditions of neighboring communities who remained as nomads alongside the expanding city-states, at least until all of them were eventually subsumed or expelled by the agriculturalists. In their legends, the Sumerian legends, Sumerian heroes battled the outlying nomadic peoples, whom they refer to in one poem as those fools who know no bread. Nomads and others who were defeated in battle were abducted into slavery, and their children were probably assimilated into the lower rungs of Sumerian society. But Sumerians also knew nomadic peoples through trade. Given such intermixing and the brutal reality of life in Sumer, it isn't entirely surprising that a faint jangle of ambivalence about this life echoes through their most epic tales. For on one level, the Epic of Gilgamesh reads like a declaration of status life as human progress. It almost sounds like this was still a foundering notion that not everyone bought into, so the elite classes wished to edify the idea. One place we see this is through the story's secondary character, Enkidu. Like the much later Adam, Enkidu was formed from clay, though by the hand of a goddess. He too begins as a man who lives uncorrupted by the knowledge of the human-built world, innocent, unaware of himself as different from the other animals among whom he lives, but even more so than Adam. Rather than wielding dominion over the beasts, Enkidu grazes grass right alongside the gazelles and drinks at their watering holes just like one of them. Yet, unlike Adam, Enkidu is not the first man. He's a foreigner from the uplands, which for the Sumerians was the unfamiliar territory of the nomads. Enkidu has come down to the plains where he goes around ruining the game traps and releasing the catch from the snares of Uruk's hunters. He was stronger and faster than a city dweller. Just as we know, foragers really were taller, healthier, and more robust than their contemporary city dwellers. In every way, Enkidu was the equal of, in fact, an alter ego of the physically extraordinary Gilgamesh, who was the strapping son of a goddess and the ruler of Uruk. But while Gilgamesh is a tyrant, Enkidu possesses a stronger sense of fairness. In this story, too, it's a woman, Shamhat, who leads Enkidu from his state of innocence into civilization. As a temple prostitute, Shamhat readily seduces Enkidu away from his gazelle companions, and her coupling with him transforms him, weakening him physically, but also bestowing him with reason and a wide understanding. When the gazelles see Enkidu after this, they reject him and they run away. But Shamhat spends weeks with Enkidu, engaging in discussion and sexual intercourse. She cleans him up, clothes him, teaches him, feeds him bread and beer, the hallmarks of civilization, and she tells him, "As I look at you, Enkidu, you are like a god. Why with the beasts do you wander the wild? Come, I will lead you to Uruk the city, to the sacred temple, the dwelling of Anu. Enkidu, arise, let me take you to Eanna, the dwelling of Anu, where men are engaged in labors of skill. You too, like a man, will find a place for yourself." Persuaded by Shamhat's enthusiasm that he should get a job, Enkidu signs on as a shepherd. But one day, upon hearing that the local king intends to sleep with someone else's bride, he's enraged. Enkidu storms to the marriage house and bars the door against Gilgamesh. The two men come to blows. Finally, their thunderous contest ends in a draw, and after this, they become inseparably devoted companions, probably lovers, and run off to adventure together. Much later, upon his deathbed, Enkidu curses Shamhat outlandishly for having civilized and weakened him, leading to his premature demise. Gilgamesh, however, persuades Enkidu to recognize civilization as a boon. Despite his own overwhelming grief upon losing his dearest companion, Gilgamesh chides his friend. "O Enkidu, why curse Shamhat the harlot, who fed you bread that was fit for a god, and poured you ale that was fit for a king, and clothed you in a splendid garment, and gave you as companion the handsome Gilgamesh?" It's primarily the stories of such agriculturalists that come down to us from Mesopotamia. The stories of those non-literate fools who know no bread can only be read where they might have been retained as fragments within the stories of the agriculturalists who eventually absorbed them, maybe representing a glimpse of a subaltern perspective within the dominant history, or perhaps coloring in the fading memory of a pre-agricultural past. But we know from indigenous peoples today that the myths and legends of foraging peoples encompass a wholly different set of worldviews, compared to those that were already well developed in the early Bronze Age cities of Mesopotamia. Many forager societies hold worldviews in which humans are not given to dominate the earth, but to discover how to live within it in a relationship of balanced reciprocity. Their stories regularly feature, for instance, episodes in which animals aid, guide, antagonize, or reveal knowledge or wisdom to people, and they often identify with or pay homage to particular animals or plants or natural spaces. Perhaps the behaviors of Enkidu in the beginning of the story were meant as a Sumerian caricature of just such beliefs and practices. The Sumerians, and later inheritors of their stories, would go on to build ever larger, more socially and economically complex city-states. They produced increasing surpluses of food and labor to be siphoned off by classes of elites as their expansionist way of life displaced or absorbed their neighbors, both human and non-human. Some 2,000 years after Gilgamesh, when the peoples of the Fertile Crescent were telling the story of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from Eden. Eden, by the way, derives from a Sumerian word meaning plain or steppe. By this time, any inherited memory of a pre-agricultural human existence had further atrophied to the barest sketch, merely a beguiling backdrop. In fact, Eden was already tame, and despite their nudity, so were Adam and Eve. Though their descent to a livelihood of agriculture is characterized as a curse, whatever came before seems merely an empty prelude to the difficult destiny that the tellers of their tale accepted they deserved to live. The essence of those stories of human destiny, first birthed in Mesopotamia, are still alive with us. In the way that mythologies have always operated and remained relevant, we have also recombined and respun them. Details have been strategically dropped or altered, our interpretations and concerns have shifted. For instance, so much is still made of the curse laid upon Eve, but why no equivalent commentary on the curse against Adam? And today, though we may read the story, we've forgotten what it meant that natural bounty once surrounded us. We've forgotten what it meant that having to rely on food you must grow yourself could be felt as a diminishment of the human condition. We've forgotten that our grave error, our original sin, which cursed the ground and brought on suffering toil, was to see ourselves as essentially different from the rest of creation, to see ourselves as gods. Indeed, as the cultures who inherited those stories grew ever more powerful, conquering others or otherwise stealing their resources and labor, their worldview of paramountcy and domination would feed into colonialist and capitalist narratives, shaping our modern conceptions of progress as human destiny. It's difficult to imagine how we might have arrived at our present condition had our dominant narratives centered stories that recognize kinship with creation and promoted values of reciprocity and balance within an interdependent web of living and non-living things. Even an awareness of the value of human population control, as opposed to upholding injunctions to subdue and take dominion over the world and all of life, even to go forth and multiply. Today, we've gone far beyond the limits known by Gilgamesh or Adam and Eve, who, for all their special status, remained yet beholden to their gods. we now presume ourselves limitless in our ambition and potential, entitled to colonize and dominate even worlds beyond Earth as our manifest destiny. We readily liken ourselves to gods. This is the story that we tell over and over again in various guises across the world today, from our popular stories of superheroes and supervillains, to the way we speak of the world as an insensate stock of exploitable commodities, to our eager articulations that technology will come to serve every transient human desire, even to our latest designs on the hoarding of wealth or how we might signal merit. Our modern neoliberal capitalist culture, built from the soil of human-centric agriculturalist stories, or paradigms, or presumptions if you prefer, of humans as godlike and entitled to planetary or even cosmic dominion, leaves us beholden to no other gods, no limits in our potentials or our appetites. And it's upon this that we construct our dangerously exploitative notions of what constitutes civilization or development and progress today. But what if we question these stories at their root? What if we recognize that our belief in ourselves as spiritually separate and existentially different from the rest of life is maladaptive to human thriving in the long run? How might that change our notions of what it means to be civilized? How to pursue development and progress? For all we've been schooled to presume that human societies are by nature capitalist and human beings are by nature primarily competitive, the long run of human prehistory argues vehemently to the contrary. Only today, our global neoliberal capitalist civilization has reached the apotheosis of relentless competition that, in its presumption of limitless growth, has utterly discarded the very notion of sustainability which many previous societies had so wisely valued and practiced. Some call this progress, but I don't believe that's a considered judgment. Capitalism is not an inevitable aspect of human nature, nor is the fundamentally unsustainable lifestyle that it has created for the elites of the world. It's time to question everything that relies upon these ubiquitous presumptions. Thank you for listening.
Wow. 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 That explains everything.
I wouldn't go that far.
It just, it was beautifully told, Usha. That was a beautiful video. Okay. So, when did you first get an inkling that these stories, might be misinterpreted, that they might be tragedies? Yeah. When did that insight come to you? And
it came in pieces over the course of years.
mm-hmm.
And since I started really reading about how did we get to this point in human history where the biosphere is collapsing, and the more I read, I came upon lots of different ideas. And along the way, I had read the Epic of Gilgamesh. I can't even remember why I originally read it. It wasn't for this reason, but as I was reading it, it just really struck me that the people who were telling this story were not 100% convinced that they had chosen the right path for themselves. It's buried, it's subtle, but it's there. I felt it was there. And then much later, I came upon a reference to the idea that in the story of Adam and Eve, that that story was about marking the transition to a lifestyle of agriculture, and that was part of the curse. So I went and I looked at it and I thought, yeah, it's clearly there. And, you know, it kind of fit, because when you listen to stories of indigenous people, even today, there is an awareness of how the world, the biosphere, obviously they don't call it that, but how it's been changing, how it's been collapsing, and how it is possible, or has been possible in the past with indigenous societies, to live a more sustainable lifestyle, and that it is a value. And, you know, maybe you don't have all the gee whiz, you know, whiz bang technologies of today, but but there are like richer social lives, richer, obviously natural lives. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I think we've got, I guess I have a question about why do you think that agriculture triggered patriarchy?
I think, I mean, I wish I could go back in time and watch it. I don't obviously know, but my sense from everything that I've read about it is that it had something to do with, first of all, sedentism, and an increased birth rate, and the fact that you need more workers for agriculture than, you know, it's a much, much more labor intensive way of life than foraging was. And so you've got, you know, stable households, you've got women giving birth, and more frequently, and actually menstruating more frequently than they probably did as nomads. And yeah, it's been shown that that nomadism, maybe because it's such an active lifestyle, and maybe it keeps people, women particularly, with less fat on their bodies, they actually menstruated less. And also they had cultural practices. We know this from modern foragers. They have cultural practices where they wean children much later than we do in industrial society, and that delays menstruation. So women nomads actually don't menstruate as frequently. So you've got like these kinds of sort of physical, biological things happening. And at the same time, you've got this this need for more laborers. You've got, you know, women sort of needing to hold still for longer. And I think it just became easier to control women. And then, of course, yeah, everyone, of course, was suffering from malnutrition in the early states. But women have a very high need for iron, and you couldn't get it from those early city-state diets. So they were probably also physically weaker than even, you know, whatever our stereotype of women. So I think a lot of things came together, and once you went down that road of holding women down and devaluing their cultural contributions, I think there's kind of a cultural feedback that it just can become very extreme. And perhaps that's what happened, something like that.
And you know, you eloquently defined the progress trap that this sedentary lifestyle begets bigger and bigger landscapes that have been turned into thistle and weeds, and it becomes an engine of destruction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's what we see in places that have been farmed for millennia. The soils are destroyed, and yeah.
So I'll keep talking, but it looks like we have a question or comment. CK? Your story reminds me the audiobook I have listened to, Ishmael. What would you do if you were given the power to shape or stem the progress of the foragers from foraging or farming and urbanizing their immediate environment? So
what would I do? Like,
I guess, CK, you want to jump on and talk? You raise your hand. Have you read the book Ishmael?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
so. I'm trying to,
that's the one.
it's about the ape, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. I
Yes.
have read
Yes.
that one
Yes.
some time
Yeah.
ago.
And so
that may be where that may be where I first heard the idea that the story was contained in there.
Yeah. Right. Right. If you were given the power to shape or stem the progress of the foragers, okay, he was on the stage, but it looks like he left. Did he leave?
Oh, there he is. Hello.
This is not. This is Samshudan. Hi, Samshudan.
Hey, how are you?
Where is
Morning,
CK?
morning. Here is morning
Morning.
in Malaysia now.
Right. Where is
Oh.
CK? Oh, was it you who asked that question? Shamshuddam. Well. I guess he's asking something about if what would you do given the power to stem the progress? What would you do if you were given that power? That's kind of a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that what happened, given the conditions, they were doing what seemed like the right thing to do at the time. People make, like even now, people continue to make choices based in what we think we know about the world and the knowledge system that's dominant today and the value systems that are dominant today. And it's hard to have like a worldview that goes beyond your immediate situation, and you find yourself sort of stuck in a, no matter what you do, it seems bad. You feel like, well, we can't all just revert to nomadism. We don't know how to do that, and those people are barbarians. Why would we do that? So you just do what seems like the right thing to do, and I don't know that in that time and place it could have been avoided.
Yeah, and we can't go back to nomadism, I think, because there are too many of us.
Too many of us, yeah. I mean, we are really
I just
stuck.
don't. Yeah, maybe that's why a virus has emerged. But so this is interesting. The indigenous people that have been talking at this conference, and their wisdom does come from the Garden of Eden, and I think that's how do we fuse these two unless we start dropping population numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news is that the human population growth is slowing down, I think faster than people had imagined it would. So that can make things maybe less bad than they might have been. But yeah, we are in a pickle. I think there's no way around acknowledging that. And
so if you, one of the reasons population is going down because of women's education, right? That we are allowing them
Yeah.
to leave the fields and the kitchen and the childbearing room and the
Make their own decisions about
make their own decisions. And so, you know,
reproduction,
encoded in that story is a little bit of, you know, it's a glimmer that says, watch out. You know, this is what happens to women if you do this. And then when we are reversing that. So that's a good trend.
Yes,
It's a
yes.
good
And
trend.
I'm sure that has a lot to do with the single greatest factor probably for the leveling off of population
Right.
eventually.
Right. Right. So I know that the majority of our students are still probably in their PJs. What time is it in India?
Yeah. It's a little after 7:30.
Yeah. Right. Right. Okay. So I guess I just want to comment on the fact that yeah, here's a question. If women were in control of the transition from foraging to farming, would the world be different? Same kind of question, CK. But I think, you know, what we were just saying is if we can give agency and choice back to women, that's a crucial piece of our story now.
Yeah, autonomy.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think, you know, interestingly, I think that to a large extent, women, you could say women were in control of the transition. I mean, in the sense that, you know, women traditionally were the foragers in society. They were the ones who knew plants. They were the ones who figured out domestication. They were probably the first ones to say, hey, you know what, we could plant this. And, you know, so on some level, it may have been, and I find it also interesting that in both of these stories, both the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Adam and Eve story, it is a woman who brings on the knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
yeah, that is interesting.
But they couldn't have imagined 1,000 years down
Right. No.
where it would land them. You know, just like we couldn't have imagined when we first started burning fossil fuels,
right,
where we would be not even 1,000 years later, but a few hundred years later. So
exactly. I guess I find it kind of incredibly endearing that these stories were preserved, that this mourning story, the story of sadness, somehow people knew it was an important one and kept it. And it got twisted and used for political purposes, but I think that's kind of a nice thing about humanity, or it's a virtue that these ancient stories are kept. And it's, you know, what unfortunately we've lost so many other hunter-gatherer cultural stories. Yeah, the majority of them. I mean, yeah. So actually, that's not very cute, but
yeah, we've lost so many perspectives and knowledge systems, and it's actually quite tragic. And now we wish we had them, or at least I wish we had them
we
to
do.
refer to.
Yes, we do. Well, people are waking up, and we have a few more minutes, right? How many more minutes do we have?
Ma'am, it's time for the next session, but we could take this conversation ahead in the table conversations after 9 o'clock, if that's okay with you. 9 a.m. IST, that is. Yeah.
Okay, so I really, you know, the number of people just jumped by 10, you know, by a fifth, because people are waking up.
Yeah.
And I just, to those of you just tuning in, this was an amazing talk. This really was. And so let's continue at the tables and move on. Thank you, Usha, so much for whipping this together in 2 weeks.
Sure.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.